Hello ladies and gentlemen, Top Hat Gaming Man here, bringing to you another installment in my series of videos covering the history of the Street Fighter series. We have already begun examining all sorts of games from the franchise, including Street Fighter 3, Street Fighter EX and even multiple entries within the Versus series. Today though, we are going to shift focus once again and go down a little bit of a rabbit hole as a result. In this week's video, we are going to take an in-depth look at the most controversial game in the entirety of the intellectual property's history. In fact, the existence of this title is such a contentious issue that it has never been re-released or upgraded since its original form. With this in mind, this is the story of Street Fighter, the movie, the game, and a deep look at whether or not it really is that awful. Yeah. The year is 1994. The Street Fighter 2 games have cemented themselves in popular culture as some of the most iconic, influential arcade games of all time. The franchise had risen to a godlike status, now ranked amongst some of the all-time greats such as Pac-Man and Space Invaders. With all success stories this big comes all sorts of cash-ins, such as clothing ranges, toys and all sorts of other merchandise. Sometimes, like in Street Fighter's case, the franchise would even receive its own high-budget movie, with $35 million being invested into making this bizarre live-action concept a reality. The movie would loosely follow the plot of Street Fighter 2 and would star Jean-Claude Van Damme as Guile in an effort to take down the film's villain M. Bison, who was played by Raul Julia, more popularly remembered as Gomez Adams. The film would somehow manage to shoehorn in most of the game's original roster, most memorably Cammy, portrayed by Kylie Minogue. From all I know with regards to this film, the making of this movie was such a production nightmare that they were lucky to even see it released, let alone it becoming a commercial success. The movie at the box office generated 3 times its production costs, and its home video and television broadcast built on that profit margin even further. Despite the movie's commercial success, it was critically panned by journalists of the era, with the New York Times describing it as a dreary, overstuffed hodgepodge of poorly edited martial arts sequences and often unintelligible dialogue. And Leonard Maltin stated that even Jean-Claude Van Damme fans couldn't rationalise this bomb. The film, along with its dubious production process, is easily something I could produce a whole video talking about in the future, or any Street Fighter movie for that matter. But today we have something far more important and pressing to talk about instead: the existence of Street Fighter the movie, the game, or even more shockingly to some Street Fighter fans, Street Fighter the movie, the games. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I did just use a plural there. Let's take a look at these games and find out if they really are awful and deserve to be as forgotten. In June 1995, a game would appear in the arcades simply titled Street Fighter the Movie. As the title suggests, this was a game that was based directly off of the live-action film that had been released the previous year. Out of all of the Street Fighter games, I feel that this game features perhaps the most epic introductory video any arcade game has ever received, packed with full motion video clips from the movie itself. In fact, it is such an amazing intro that simply talking about it does not do it justice, so I may as well show you it in its entirety now. Wow, From the full motion video to the gameplay clips to the classic Street Fighter 2 music in that introduction, every element composed within that sequence was good enough to make anyone part of their hard-earned coinage, in my opinion. But enough doting on this epicness, let's talk about the actual game. Upon arriving at the character select screen, you can choose from a selection of 14 different characters, all of which are represented by actors as opposed to sprite work. Most of the cast of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo are present here, with the exception of Blanka, T-Hawk, V-Long, DJ and Dalsim, although some of these do occasionally pop up on certain stages. In regards to these mission characters, they were at one point apparently planned to be in the game, however due to time constraints were unfortunately left out. With regards to the characters featured in the game, this was the first fighting game in history that featured Akuma as a readily available playable character, as opposed to a secret character such as in X-Men Children of the Atom and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. The game also featured two brand new roster members who both appeared as characters in the movie. Firstly, Blade, who is a member of Bison's Shock Troop in the movie, who features a number of Shock Trooper palette swaps, each featuring their own names. Secondly, we have Sawada, a character who was Guile's right-hand man in the production. This character is particularly interesting, as at one point he was rumoured to have been positioned to become the real-life face of Capcom, and an action hero they plan to use in later movie material. However, reflecting back now, if this was ever the case, it certainly never came into fruition. Now, moving on from the roster itself, at first glance when looking at this game, it is easy to instantly identify the departure from the norm when it comes to this series. Gone was the beautiful sprite work, and in its place the game's characters appear as digitised images. I would assume this huge change to the usual formula was made in an attempt to make the game look more movie-like and a way of including the film's actors in some way, which I guess artistically wasn't a bad idea at all. However, with this, it is also easy to simply view the game as a bit of a Mortal Kombat rip-off. This change in art direction was possible due to the fact that the game was developed by Chicago-based company Incredible Technologies, rather than Capcom themselves, like with most other iterations from the Street Fighter series. As a result, the game was not programmed to run using traditional Capcom system arcade boards, and instead ran off of Incredible Technologies' 32-bit own board. The character animations in this game were each made up of between 600 and 800 digitised frames, and featured an impressive 256 colour palette. This was a huge technical step up from the 16 colours found in previous Capcom system based Street Fighter games, and even more than the 64 colours featured in Mortal Kombat, the fighting franchise that was the king of digitised animations. As expected, at its heart the game is a standard 2D fighter, however other elements of the gameplay differ from that of previous entries in the Street Fighter series. The combat is different in many places, including a heavier focus on air combat than with games that had come prior. What I mean by this is that players can continuously attack a player whilst they remain airborne, almost in a juggling-like manner as they fall through the air. Many of the characters also have brand new special moves that remain unique to this game, and some characters have gained the ability to reflect projectile attacks, such as the Hadouken or Sonic Boom. Grappling attacks were also altered in this game, and as a result players have the opportunity to escape their opponent's throws. When doing so, the player can evade damage or perform a counter throw, and even counter throws can be countered too. The game also contained a mechanic known as interrupt moves, which are possible when your HP is low. These allow the player to perform a comeback attack after successfully blocking an opponent's move. This feature is similar to alpha counters and ultra combos that would appear in later entries in the series. The super combo gauge, used in some of the later versions of Street Fighter 2, is also present in this game. As a result, the characters can obviously perform super combos, but in this game's case, the attacks leave trails of coloured shadows to further emphasise the moves. Additionally, the Super Combo gauge also features an extra function in that if it's full, it can be exchanged for extra health in the player's Vitality gauge, a function that would later resurface in the EX series and Street Fighter 3. As expected, the single player mode involves you facing off against various opponents, all 14 characters in this game's case, including a palette swap bout against whichever character you happen to be playing as. This all leads up to a final boss fight against M. Bison, the lead antagonist from both the Street Fighter 2 series and the live action movie this game is based upon. The game also features tag team matches, a fact that would probably be music to Teddy Long's ears. Sadly though, these do not operate in the same way found within the Capcom Vs series, and instead you and your opponent just have 2 fighters each, but can only play as your second fighter once the first one has been KO'd. So these are essentially more like 2-on-2 matches rather than traditional tag team matches, players. Visually, the game is a mixed bag. The stages in which fights take place on are varied, and some look more impressive than others, particularly that stage with other characters stringed up in the background, in my opinion. All in all, you can probably see this game is okay, I suppose, but apart from the characters and the fact that this is a 2D versus fighter, its similarities with other Street Fighter games pretty much end there. The digitised fighters are certainly a flavour of the times, and as a result somewhat of an acquired taste today. In regards to the gameplay itself and all the mechanical changes made, it is not a game that really feels like Street Fighter, which I guess makes a lot of sense considering that this game was not developed by Capcom anyway. At least with Street Fighter EX, which we looked at last week, Akira of Arika had worked on Street Fighter 2 previously. So all in all, the game is in my opinion more of an interesting curiosity rather than a quintessential Street Fighter experience. In regards to review coverage given to this game at the time, Next Generation covered the title, awarding the game a mere 2 out of 5 stars, who like many were unimpressed with the ridiculous concept of a game that was based off of a movie that was based off of the game. They described the gameplay as neither brilliantly conceived nor sleepily dull, and as a result, never really heavily praised nor criticised the game. They signed off with Chun-Li's somersaulting, thigh-clapping face slapper, or M. Bison's lightning bolts. You'll have a bit of fun. Outside of Next Generation, this is the only coverage I could dig up for the arcade game from around the period. However, I thought it may also be interesting to look at some retrospective opinions on the game. FightersGeneration.com for example stated, "One can't fault Capcom for trying something new and attempting to keep up with the times. However, in 1995-1996, so many other amazing fighting games were making a name for themselves in arcades and on home consoles." In fairness, this was really the first misstep of the Street Fighter series. More of a story, stick to your guns and do your thing. It's a cringe-worthy masterpiece, just like the movie. The only reason to ever play this game is for historic comic value. But be warned, playing this game is mostly painful. In Swank World's retrospective, they stated that while Street Fighter the movie borrowed from other games in the genre and adopted a graphical style that was on vogue at the time, it's not a bad attempt at a movie game. I just don't really feel right in calling it a cash-in game, more than I like calling it a knockoff. To summarise, as you can see, the arcade game was far from popular, and as a result, I do not believe many people even realise the title exists, particularly when you take into account that the home console versions of Street Fighter the movie were entirely different games, rather than ports like many would expect from a Street Fighter title. So with that said, let us have a look at Street Fighter the movie, the console games. Yeah! The console game was released across 2 formats, the Sony PlayStation and the Sega Saturn, both seeing a release in Japan and North America in August of 1995, and European releases would also follow 1 month later in September. Unlike the arcade version of the game, this title would in fact be developed by Capcom themselves, and has the dubious honour of serving as one of the Sony PlayStation's launch titles in North America. The same digitised images of the film's cast from the previous game make a return, however, were processed differently from the arcade version of the game. The stages though are completely different from the ones found in the arcade. Since the game was developed by Capcom, the combat system in this one is much closer to that of which was found in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the most recent incarnation of Street Fighter 2 in relation to this game's release. Special moves and super combos from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo are back, and in addition, characters can now perform extra attacks known as super special moves, which function much in the same way as ES moves from the Darkstalker series. 4 play modes are present this time around. Most interestingly, Movie Battle Mode, a mode where you can play the game as Guile and follow the plot of the movie in a quest to defeat Bison. As you progress through this play mode, you can select from branching paths after certain fights. This helps determine how quickly you can make it to Bison himself. In terms of the fighting game's roster, there are some differences from that of the game's arcade counterpart. Sawada makes a return, for example, however he features completely different special moves in this iteration. The other new character, Blade, along with his various Bison Trooper palette swaps, are completely absent from this game too. Akuma is no longer selectable and instead once again reprises his traditional role as a secret character hidden within the game. Further to this, DJ and Blanca, who are missing from the arcade game, finally make an appearance in this one, now meaning that T-Hawk and Dhalsim are now the only two characters from Street Fighter 2's roster not present. This game would go on to receive a similar response from journalists to that of the arcade game, and as a result would receive a mixture of average to negative reviews. Sega Saturn magazine, for example, moaned about the game featuring excessive slowdown and even complained that it was not a conversion of the arcade game with the same name, but simply another port of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo with digitised graphics. Electronic Gaming Monthly were displeased with the controls, but liked the full motion video and overall gameplay mechanics. Like many people today, there was even some confusion with reviewers of the time believing that the console game was a port of the game that appeared in the arcades a few months earlier, all in all confusing even more people in the process. GamePro hated the console game, slating the game's slow and choppy animation, weak battle voices, unpredictable frame redraw, and the quick recovery time of fighters, saying this results in a wait and strike defensive game rather than a true competitive Street Fighter match. The publication Maximum also thought the game was poor, condemning the game's frame rate, whilst claiming the game was just Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo with digitised graphics. They went on to say, the fluid, instinctual response of the previous Street Fighter games seems to have been lost, and with it any real compulsion to play it. GamePro said the PlayStation had long load times, conspicuous glitches, control lag, bad voice acting and muddy sprites which failed to resemble the actors from the film. The only resource source to put somewhat of a positive spin on the game was Next Generation magazine, who heavily praised the Saturn game for its large array of characters and play modes. They even went as far to say that the game looks and plays great. Although, hilariously, another reviewer from the same publication would chastise the PlayStation version, stating it's one of the worst launch games for the PlayStation, that will be largely remembered for being an abject embarrassment. So, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, both Street Fighter the movie games, two of the most critically panned titles in the franchise's entire history. So now, to answer the initial question from this video's title, are these games really that awful? Personally, from the time I have spent with these games and ploughing through both reviews from the time along with modern retrospectives, I am going to say both yes and no. With regards to the arcade game, if you look at it purely from the perspective of wanting a good Street Fighter experience, then you are not going to find it when playing that one. However, as a standalone fighter, it really isn't that bad, just nowhere near the usual Street Fighter standard. In terms of the console game, it is much closer to traditional Street Fighter 2 gameplay, but still nowhere near as good. But the Battle Movie mode is a unique feature, bringing this title a little closer to the movie than that of the arcade counterpart. So I suppose all in all, these are not good Street Fighter games, but are both still playable fighting games, just not particularly great ones. I would say though, looking at this through modern eyes, the novelty of being able to play as the actors from the movie alone is enough to justify these games ridiculously existing. So to visit the question once again, are these games really that awful? Yes, they are that awful if you are looking for a good traditional Street Fighter experience. But no, absolutely not if you want something novel, ridiculous and full of mid-90s cult movie cheese. In fact, I really hope that this video even spurs some more of you on to put in some time into these games, as the absurdity of their existences really should result in them being paid a little more attention. Even meme culture seems to neglect these games somewhat when you measure them up to the likes of Hotel Mario or the Wand of Gamelon. For now, Street Fighter the movie, the games, will simply remain an odd footnote in gaming history. But an odd footnote in gaming history I am certainly very pleased exists. These games are certainly acquired tastes, but certainly worth experiencing for those who want to dig a little deeper. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Street Fighter the movie, The Games. The most panned games in the franchise's history. If you enjoyed today's content, please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss a video. Please leave me some of your thoughts and suggestions in the comment section below on what you would like to see on this channel next. Finally, to conclude this video, my channel Top Hat Gaming Man is funded by the fantastic support I receive from my amazing Patreon supporters who really do relieve an element of stress from my life and help encourage me to get videos out to you all every week. So a huge thank you and a massive shout out to Carl Johnson, JD Robbins, Seabass the Great, Synth Spaces, Andrew Bazansky, Edward O'Reilly, Quang DX, BuzzMatt B, Michael Baker, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins and all of my other patrons. Thank you all for changing my life.